Margaret O'Brien had built her new life on forgotten things. Porcelain dolls, dusty mirrors, music boxes that hadn't sung in decades. But at 3:17 a.m., one of those objects woke up. From her apartment above forgotten treasures, she heard it. A Victorian music box playing Frère Jacques in a minor key that sounded nothing like a lullaby. The sound drifted through the floorboards like a funeral hymn, each note colder than the last. Margaret hadn't wound that box in days. She crept downstairs, the air heavy with the scent of lavender and something darker, decay. The music stopped the moment her foot touched the shop floor, but the ballerina inside was still spinning. Slowly, deliberately, her painted smile twisted into a scream. Then came the dolls. Their glass eyes caught the moonlight, watching her. One turned its head, just enough to let her know she was no longer alone. And then the whisper. High, fragile, unmistakable. Margaret, why did you take us from our home? The sound of children's voices in an empty shop. This was the night Margaret O'Brien learned that antiques don't just carry history. Sometimes they carry the dead. When Margaret O'Brien heard the Victorian music box playing at 3:17 a.m., she knew the dead children trapped inside her antique shop had finally found their voice. What she discovered next would shatter everything she believed about the harmless treasures filling her store. Margaret had always thought running an antique shop would be peaceful. After her divorce 2 years ago, she'd poured her life savings into Forgotten Treasures, a cramped Victorian storefront in Salem's historic district. The irony wasn't lost on her, a woman trying to rebuild her life by selling remnants of other people's past. But tonight, as she sat in her small apartment above the shop, the melody drifting up through the floorboards wasn't peaceful at all. It was the haunting tune of Frère Jacques, played in a minor key that made her skin crawl. She hadn't wound that music box in days. Margaret crept down the narrow staircase, her bare feet silent on the worn wood. The shop's familiar scents, lavender sachets, old leather, and furniture polish, now seemed tainted with something else, something that smelled like decay. The music stopped the moment her foot touched the shop floor. In the moonlight streaming through the front windows, her carefully arranged displays looked different, wrong. The Victorian dolls on the corner shelf seemed to be staring directly at her, their glass eyes reflecting the streetlight outside like tiny mirrors of accusation. But the truly shocking part was what she saw when she approached the music box. The tiny ballerina inside was spinning, slowly, deliberately, without music, without being wound. Her painted face, which Margaret remembered as sweetly smiling, now appeared to be screaming. Margaret's hands trembled as she slammed the box shut. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the music. It's just old mechanism, she whispered to herself. Springs settle. Metal expands and contracts, but deep down she knew this wasn't about old springs. This was about Mrs. Henderson. 3 weeks ago, Margaret had attended an estate sale in Marblehead. The elderly Mrs. Henderson had died alone in her Victorian mansion, and her distant relatives wanted everything gone quickly. The prices were almost insultingly low, which should have been Margaret's first warning. She'd bought the music box along with a collection of vintage dolls and an ornate hand mirror that the auctioneer claimed dated back to the 1880s. The previous owner seemed eager to get rid of everything, practically shoving the items into Margaret's van. Now she understood why. The next morning brought Margaret's first customer of the day, Mrs. Patterson, a regular who collected Victorian-era jewelry. But when Mrs. Patterson approached the antique mirror Margaret had mounted on the back wall, her cheerful demeanor changed instantly. "Dear God," Mrs. Patterson whispered, staring into the mirror's surface. There's someone behind me." Margaret looked into the mirror, too. She saw Mrs. Patterson's reflection clearly. But behind her, where empty shop space should have been, a shadow figure stood, tall, motionless, watching. Margaret spun around. The shop was empty except for the two of them. When she looked back at the mirror, the shadow was gone. But Mrs. Patterson was backing toward the door, her face pale with terror. "I'm sorry, dear," Mrs. Patterson stammered. "I just remembered. I have an appointment." She fled, leaving Margaret alone with her reflection and the growing certainty that something was very, very wrong. Wait a second. Don't miss this detail about what happened next. That afternoon, Margaret tried to research the mirror's history online. She found records of the Henderson estate going back generations, but what she discovered made her blood run cold. The mirror had belonged to Martha Henderson, Mrs. Henderson's great-great-grandmother, who had died in 1889 under mysterious circumstances. Martha had been found in her bedroom, sitting before this very mirror, apparently having died from shock. Her face was frozen in an expression of absolute terror, and her hair had turned completely white overnight. The local newspaper from 1889 mentioned that Martha had been heard talking to someone in her room for hours before her death. But when family members broke down the door, she was alone, completely alone. Margaret's research was interrupted by a sound that made her heart stop, children's laughter coming from the doll corner. But there were no children in the shop. She approached the vintage doll collection slowly, each step feeling like walking toward her own grave. The 5 dolls sat in their usual positions on the antique settee, but something had changed. Their positions were different. One doll with golden ringlets and a blue velvet dress was now turned toward the others as if leading a conversation. And its mouth, Margaret could swear its painted lips had been closed when she'd arranged them that morning. Now they were slightly parted, as if caught mid-sentence. "Hello," she whispered to the dolls, feeling foolish but unable to stop herself. The golden-haired doll's head turned to look at her. Margaret stumbled backward, knocking over a small table. A ceramic figurine crashed to the floor, but she barely heard it over the sound of her own terrified breathing. This was the moment when everything changed. That night, Margaret couldn't bring herself to go upstairs to her apartment. Instead, she sat in the shop's back office, nursing a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. Every shadow seemed to move. Every creak of the old building sounded like footsteps. Around midnight, the whispers began. At first, Margaret thought it was the wind outside, or perhaps late-night pedestrians on the street. But as she listened more carefully, she realized the voices were coming from inside the shop. Multiple voices. Children's voices. "Where is Mama?" one voice asked. "Mama went away," another replied. "Will she come back?" "She never comes back." Margaret forced herself to investigate, grabbing a flashlight and moving through the darkened shop. The voices grew clearer as she approached the doll corner, but when she shined her light on them, they were exactly as she'd left them. Except for their eyes. All 5 dolls were now looking directly at her, their glass eyes reflecting her flashlight beam like tiny stars of accusation. "You won't believe this." But that's when she heard the first name. "Margaret," whispered the golden-haired doll. Its lips didn't move, but the voice was crystal clear. "Why did you take us from our home?" Margaret's flashlight clattered to the floor. In the darkness, she heard more voices joining in. "We want to go home." "Take us home, Margaret." "Home to Mama. 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 Mama." The chorus of children's voices rose to a crescendo that seemed to shake the very walls of the shop. Margaret ran for the light switch, flooding the room with harsh fluorescent brightness. Silence. The dolls sat motionless, innocent, their painted faces sweet and serene. But Margaret noticed something that made her stomach lurch. Tiny, wet tracks ran down each doll's cheeks, as if they had been crying. But the real shock was still coming. The next day brought Detective Sarah Murphy to Margaret's door. A tall woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, Detective Murphy had questions about the Henderson estate sale. "I'm sorry to bother you, Ms. O'Brien," Detective Murphy said, "but we're looking into some irregularities regarding Mrs. Henderson's death. I understand you purchased several items from her estate." Margaret invited her in, grateful for human company after the previous night's terror. "Is everything all right? I just bought some antiques at the estate sale." Detective Murphy examined the music box and dolls with professional interest. Mrs. Henderson's death wasn't as straightforward as initially thought. Her neighbors reported hearing children's voices coming from her house for weeks before she died. But Mrs. Henderson lived alone, and there were never any children in the house. The detective paused at the Victorian mirror, studying her own reflection with obvious unease. "The strange thing is," Detective Murphy continued, "Mrs. Henderson's final words to her visiting nurse were about the children. She kept saying they wanted to go home, that they missed their mother." Margaret felt ice forming in her veins. "What children?" "That's what we're trying to figure out." Mrs. Henderson's medical records show she'd been taking anxiety medication for months, claiming she was being haunted by children who had died in her house. But there's no record of any children dying there. What you've seen so far is nothing compared to what Detective Murphy found next. The detective pulled out a manila folder filled with old photographs. "We found these in Mrs. Henderson's bedroom, scattered around that mirror you bought. They're from the 1920s. The first photograph showed a family portrait, a mother and 5 children posed formally in Victorian dress. Margaret's breath caught in her throat as she recognized the children's faces. They were identical to her dolls. The same golden ringlets on the oldest girl, the same serious expression on the boy in knickers, the same delicate features on the 3 younger girls. According to the back of the photo, Detective Murphy said, "This is the Whitmore family. They lived in Mrs. Henderson's house in 1923. All 5 children died during the influenza pandemic that winter." Margaret's hands shook as she examined the photograph. The mother in the picture was writing something on a piece of paper, her face etched with grief. "The mother survived," Detective Murphy continued, "but she never recovered from losing her children. Neighbors reported that she would set places at the dinner table for them every night, have conversations with empty chairs, tuck imaginary children into their beds." The detective flipped to another photograph, this one showing the same woman sitting before the Victorian mirror. But now her hair was completely white, and her expression was one of absolute terror. This was taken just before Eleanor Whitmore died in 1925. Same circumstances as Mrs. Henderson, found dead in front of that mirror, apparently from shock. But Detective Murphy wasn't finished. She had one more photograph that would change everything Margaret thought she knew. The final picture showed the 5 Whitmore children's dolls, the exact dolls now sitting in Margaret's shop. They had been made to commemorate the children after their deaths, crafted by a local doll maker to help their mother cope with her grief. The doll maker's notes indicate that Eleanor Whitmore requested each doll be made with a locket of the corresponding child's hair sewn into the stuffing, Detective Murphy explained. She believed it would help her stay connected to them. Margaret stared at the dolls with new horror. They weren't just antiques. They were vessels, containers for the essence of 5 dead children who had been loved so desperately that their mother had trapped them in porcelain and cloth rather than let them go. And now they were in Margaret's shop, crying for a mother who had been dead for nearly a century. Just when they thought they understood the situation, something happened that no one could have predicted. That evening, after Detective Murphy left, Margaret sat alone in her shop, trying to process everything she'd learned. The children's voices had been quiet all day, but as darkness fell, she could feel their presence growing stronger. The music box began to play again, its tinny melody echoing through the shop like a funeral dirge. This time, Margaret didn't try to stop it. Instead, she approached the dolls with newfound understanding. "I know who you are," she said softly. "You're the Whitmore children. You're looking for your mother." The golden-haired doll's head turned slowly to face her. "Eleanor," it whispered. "Where is Eleanor?" She's gone," Margaret said, her heart breaking for these trapped souls. "She died a long time ago." The temperature in the shop dropped noticeably. The other dolls began to turn their heads, their glass eyes fixing on Margaret with expressions of profound sadness. "We want to go home," the boy doll said. "We've been waiting so long," added one of the younger girls. "Everyone leaves us," said another. "Eleanor left. Martha left. Now you'll leave too." Margaret felt tears streaming down her face. "I'm not going to leave you, but I can't take you home either. Your home is gone." That's when the mirror began to glow. A soft, silvery light emanated from its surface, and gradually an image began to form in the glass. It wasn't Margaret's reflection anymore. It was a woman in early 20th century dress, her hair white as snow, her arms outstretched as if reaching through the mirror's surface. "Eleanor," whispered all 5 dolls in unison. The woman in the mirror opened her mouth as if to speak, but no sound came out. Her expression was one of infinite sorrow and desperate longing. As soon as they saw their mother's image, the dolls began to move on their own, climbing down from their shelf and walking across the shop floor with jerky, unnatural movements. They gathered in front of the mirror, their small hands pressed against its surface. The scene was beautiful and terrible at the same time. 5 lost children trying to reach their mother through a barrier they could never cross. But you haven't seen the biggest surprise yet. Margaret was so focused on the reunion playing out before her that she didn't notice the man standing in her shop doorway until he spoke. "They've been trapped for so long," he said, his voice gentle but filled with authority. Margaret spun around to find an elderly man in a weathered coat and wide-brimmed hat. Despite the late hour and the locked door, he stood there as naturally as if he'd been invited. "I'm sorry," Margaret stammered. "We're closed, and I don't know how you got in." "My name is Edmund," the man said, removing his hat to reveal kind eyes and silver hair. "I'm a professor of medieval history, but I've spent considerable time studying spiritual attachments to objects." Something about his presence was immediately calming. The frantic energy in the shop seemed to settle as he approached the mirror and the gathered dolls. "These children have been bound to these vessels for nearly a century," the guardian continued, kneeling down to the doll's level. "Their mother's love was so powerful, so desperate, that it created a spiritual prison instead of providing comfort." "Can you help them?" Margaret asked, though she wasn't sure why she trusted this stranger so completely. The guardian smiled sadly. "They can be helped, but it requires releasing them properly. Their mother's grief has kept them tethered to this world, but with the right ritual, they can finally find peace." As he spoke, the dolls turned to look at him, their expressions hopeful for the first time since Margaret had known them. This was their last chance at freedom. The guardian instructed Margaret to gather several items: white candles, a bowl of spring water, and photographs of the children from their living days. As she collected these things, he explained the process. "We must acknowledge their mother's love, while helping her understand that holding on to them is causing them pain," he said. "Eleanor's spirit has been trapped here as surely as her children's, unable to move on because she can't bear to let them go." They arranged the candles in a circle around the mirror with the dolls positioned between the light and their mother's image. The guardian began to speak in a voice that seemed to carry the weight of centuries. "Eleanor Whitmore, your love for your children is a beautiful thing, but love sometimes means letting go. Your children have been waiting patiently, but they are ready to rest now." The image in the mirror flickered, and for a moment, Eleanor's voice could be heard, faint but clear. I can't lose them again." "You won't lose them," the guardian replied gently. "You'll be reunited, but in the place where you're all meant to be. Not trapped between worlds, but together in peace." The dolls began to glow with the same silvery light as the mirror. One by one, they reached out toward their mother's image. "It's time, Eleanor," the guardian said. "Release them and go with them." But the real shock was what happened when Eleanor finally let go. As the mother's image in the mirror reached out to embrace her children, the dolls transformed. The porcelain and cloth dissolved like morning mist, revealing 5 translucent figures, the spirits of the Whitmore children, free at last from their vessels. They ran to their mother's image, and as they touched the mirror's surface, they passed through it as if it were water. Eleanor's face filled with joy and relief as she gathered her children in her arms. "Thank you," she whispered, looking directly at Margaret. "Thank you for caring about them." The light in the mirror grew brighter and brighter until Margaret had to shield her eyes. When it faded, the mirror showed only her own reflection. The dolls were gone. Nothing remained but 5 small piles of antique fabric and porcelain dust. The shop felt different now, lighter. The oppressive atmosphere that had been building for weeks was gone, replaced by a sense of peace. Margaret turned to thank the guardian, but he was already walking toward the door. "Wait," she called after him. "How did you know to come here? How did you know what to do?" The guardian paused in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the streetlight outside. "Sometimes, those who need help call out to those who can provide it." The children's voices carried farther than you might think. "Will I see you again?" Margaret asked. "I hope not," he replied with a kind smile. "If you need to see me again, it means more spirits are trapped, and I'd rather that didn't happen." He stepped out into the night and seemed to vanish into the shadows between the streetlights. The next morning, Margaret's curiosity about her mysterious helper got the better of her. Professor Edmund Hartwell had seemed so knowledgeable, so prepared for exactly what had happened in her shop. She wanted to thank him properly, maybe even ask him more questions about spiritual attachments. She searched online for Professor Edmund Hartwell Medieval History and found several academic papers from the 1990s. The author's photo matched the man who had helped her perfectly. The same kind eyes, the same silver hair, even the same weathered coat. But when Margaret looked more carefully at the publication dates, her blood ran cold. The most recent paper was from 1998. According to the university website, Professor Edmund Hartwell had died in 2003 at the age of 72. The obituary mentioned his lifelong fascination with objects that serve as conduits between the living and the dead. Margaret stared at her computer screen, her hands shaking. The man who had saved her and the Whitmore children had been dead for over 20 years. Everyone had learned the truth. But the real shock was what Margaret discovered next. When she opened the shop, she found a handwritten note on her counter, though she was certain it hadn't been there the night before. The paper was aged and yellowed, as if it had been written decades ago. The note was from Eleanor Whitmore, dated 1925. "To whoever finds my children's dolls, they are not toys. They are vessels of love that became prisons of grief. If you hear their voices, please help them find peace. I never meant to trap them. I only meant to keep them close. Thank you for your kindness. Eleanor. Below. Eleanor's signature was a postscript in different handwriting, fresh ink on the old paper. They are free now and at peace. The Guardian. Margaret folded the note carefully and placed it in her cash register. She would keep it as a reminder of the night she learned that love, however pure its intentions, could become a prison if held too tightly. The Victorian mirror still hung on her wall, but now it reflected only what stood before it. No shadows, no spirits, no desperate mothers reaching for children they couldn't save. Just when Margaret thought her supernatural ordeal was over, she received a phone call that would change everything once more. Miss O'Brien? The voice was hesitant, elderly. This is Robert Ashworth. I heard about your shop from Mrs. Henderson's lawyer. I have some family heirlooms I'd like to sell, but I should warn you, there might be some unusual activity associated with them. Margaret felt a strange tingling sensation as he spoke, as if something inside her was awakening. She could sense the pain in his voice, the weight of secrets he carried. What kind of activity, Mr. Ashworth? She asked, surprised by her own calmness. My grandfather's pocket watch. It stops at the exact time he died. And there's a music box that plays funeral marches on its own. My family's been dealing with these things for generations, but they're getting more active, more demanding. Margaret looked around her peaceful shop, then at Eleanor's note in her hand. She realized that her experience with the Whitmore children had changed her in ways she was only beginning to understand. Mr. Ashworth, she said with newfound confidence, I think I can handle unusual activity. In fact, I think I might be able to help more than you know. When would you like to bring them in? Tomorrow afternoon? I really hope you can help. We've tried everything else. As she hung up the phone, Margaret realized that her shop had become something more than just a place to sell antiques. It had become a way station for spirits who needed help moving on, and she had become their guide. The Guardian had seen something in her that she was only now beginning to recognize, a gift for helping the lost find peace. She touched the empty space where the Victorian mirror hung, remembering the Guardian's gentle wisdom and Eleanor's grateful smile. Whatever came next, she would be ready. And somewhere in the space between worlds, she could have sworn she heard the faint sound of children's laughter, not trapped or desperate anymore, but free and joyful, finally at peace.